Today, when we say a population or a city was decimated, we usually mean it was annihilated. But the word originates from the Latin term decimatio, and historically, its definition was precise. It meant the removal of exactly 1/10. For centuries, pop culture has served up a terrifying image of Roman military discipline. We picture iron-fisted commanders casually ordering troops into lines, drawing lots, and forcing soldiers into bludgeoning their own friends to death to keep the ranks in line. But the historical record reveals a persistent gap in that narrative. During the height of the Roman Republic, this indiscriminate slaughter of their own men was essentially a ghost story. We tend to view the Roman war machine as driven by absolute terror. But if their most infamous punishment is actually an anachronistic illusion, how did it become the defining symbol of their military might? To understand why commanders weren't regularly culling their own ranks, we have to look at the law. Between 199 and 193 BC, Rome passed the Porcian Laws, which granted citizens strict legal protections against arbitrary violence. Crucially, these rights extended to the battlefield. A Roman general could not legally order the mass execution of his citizen soldiers on a whim, no matter how badly a battle was going. There was a legally recognized punishment for individual crimes like theft or desertion. It was called fustorium, where a single guilty soldier was beaten. But grabbing 10% of an entire cohort and slaughtering them without a trial, that was illegal. For generations, decimation survived strictly as an aristocratic talking point. It was a legend invoked by politicians back in Rome to sound tough on discipline, rather than a practical tool ever deployed in the mud of a real campaign. That status quo held until 71 BC. A gladiator named Spartacus had raised an army of former slaves and repeatedly routed highly trained Roman legions right in the heart of Italy. This losing streak triggered what the Romans called metus, a society-wide psychosis of fear. An army of rural poor and escaped slaves was tearing through the countryside, threatening to invert the entire social hierarchy. In the midst of this escalating panic, a Roman unit of 500 men dropped their weapons and fled the battlefield in terror. The state was facing an existential threat, and in that vacuum of total desperation, extreme measures that were legally unthinkable suddenly became options on the table. The commander tasked with stopping Spartacus was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Needing to establish absolute control over a terrified army, he bypassed Roman law and decided to drag the ancient rumor of decimation into reality. Crassus divided the 500 men into tens, forcing them to draw lots. 50 drew the short straw. The horror was its design. No designated firing squad. The 450 survivors had to bludgeon their comrades to death. The psychological torment didn't end with the executions. The survivors were stripped of their standard wheat rations, forced to eat raw barley, and made to sleep outside the protective walls of the military camp, leaving them vulnerable to enemy attack. Crassus had openly murdered his own citizen soldiers without a trial, yet he was never prosecuted for the crime. The Roman public was so terrified of Spartacus that they traded the rule of law for the promise of security. By surviving the political fallout of the atrocity, Crassus transformed decimation from a rhetorical myth into a viable military precedent. He demonstrated that during a crisis, a commander could ignore the law and use collective punishment to shock an army back into obedience. This precedent lived on in the military imagination, resurfacing sporadically in European conflicts, like the brutal meat grinder of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. But the practice didn't stay buried in antiquity or early modern history. It carried right into the mechanized slaughter of the First World War. It turns out that whenever military structures face total systemic collapse, the temptation to restore order through random collective violence inevitably returns to the surface. In 1917, the Italian army was cracking under the immense strain of trench warfare. When a mutiny broke out in the Catanzaro Brigade, General Luigi Cadorna responded by ordering their decimation. Cadorna had his own men randomly selected by lot and executed by their peers. He bypassed all legal tribunals to broadcast a message of pure terror to the rest of his ranks. Does terrorizing your own troops forge them into a more effective fighting force? The historical record suggested failed. Instead of instilling an offensive spirit, Cadorna's executions shattered the brigade's morale and contributed directly to his dismissal as commander-in-chief later that year. Ordering troops to execute their own comrades doesn't prove an army is invincible. It proves that a commander is terrified and has lost total control of his men.